area is famed as the birthplace of the computer. One of the jewels of Silicon Valley and our whole region is the renowned Computer History Museum. And we are honored to be able to have with us today its president and CEO, John C. Hollar. We've asked John to share some of his thoughts on the future of community media. Let me tell you a little bit about John. He led the development behind the museum's major permanent exhibition, which is called Revolution, the first 2,000 years of computing. It's been described as the Valley's answer to the Smithsonian. John's career spans global media production and exemplifies his long-standing passion for both media and education. He serves as the executive producer, and he's a frequent host of Revolutionaries, a weekly series that is produced with KQED in San Francisco. Before joining the museum, he was president of Penguin Television and Pearson Broadband in London. He also served as executive vice president of PBS, where he founded and launched the award-winning PBS.org. Sound familiar? PBSkids.org, and a wide array of national educational services, including PBS Teacher Line. Significant contributions. He's been the executive producer of more than 200 hours of documentary and children's television. Please help me in welcoming John Hollar.
Thank you so much. Annie, thank you so much. It's such an honor for me to be here today, and just to say what an amazing array of talent, of commitment, of community, of creative people, people who are right here among us. And as a citizen of this area, my wife Mindy and I live in Menlo Park, and someone who deeply loves media too. I just want to say how exciting it is for me to be here and share with you the excitement of the relaunch of this studio. Digital is the future, and it's so nice that this amazing digital equipment and this studio can be here to be a resource for the community, just like it has been for the last 25 years. I'm going to talk today just briefly about the future of community media, and like any good historian, I'm going to start with talking about history, because history is so much of the window into the future. I joke that we're the only history museum in the world that has more future than it does history, which is something only the Computer History Museum might be able to say. So we spend a great deal of time thinking about this connection between the past and the future, and I had a couple of insights on three topic areas that I think are relevant to what we've been seeing today and what we want to see today from this Community Media Center. The three areas I want to talk about are policy and technology and then community. So in the policy area, I happen to be very interested in the First Amendment, and when I was in Washington, D.C., I was on the staff of a commissioner named Irvin Duggan at the Federal Communications Commission. This was about 1990, from 1990 to 92. And this is when the cable industry and Congress were at loggerheads. The 1985 Cable Act had been passed. It had required the creation of media centers like this all over the country, the creation of public access channels, things the cable industry strongly, strongly opposed. And in 1992, they were still opposing it. 7 years later, they just hadn't given it up. And so when the Cable Act of 1992 was passed, the cable industry did everything it could to kill public access channels and everything that this Community Media Center stands for. I used to say that if we lived in a parliamentary system, the veto of the 1992 Cable Act by George Bush, which was then overridden by Congress, would have been the fall of the government. And of course, a month later, it was the fall of the government because Bill Clinton was elected president. It was the only veto that was ever overridden in that part of the Bush administration. He didn't want the Cable Act of 1992 passed because it was even more heavily regulatory on the cable industry, and it gave even more protection to public access channels and PEG channels than the 1985 Act had given. So that's sort of the policy background on something I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is where is all this policy going to go in the future. That battle has been fought in Congress. It was fought very diligently for 7 or 8 years, and now it's stood for almost as long as this media center has stood for. That's the policy side of it. On the technology side of it, we're standing 1,000 yards from the site of the most transformational idea in the most transformational period in human history. There have been lots of transformational periods in human history. None have moved as quickly as the one we're going through now. There have been lots of transformational places in the world. You think of the Renaissance, the Reformation, other very large ideas. None have been as widely distributed as the transformation that we're going through now. And it all began about 1,000 yards from here, just across from the JCC, where Fairchild Semiconductor did most of its important work during the 1960s. This year is the 50th anniversary of the famous paper that Gordon Moore, the boy from Pescadero, wrote, setting forth a principle called Moore's Law. And Gordon said basically that computers were going to get faster, they were going to double in speed about every 18 months. He wrote that paper in 1965. And every year since 1965, for the last 50 years, that has happened. Now, something really important is about to happen, because if you're a mathematician, you understand that that kind of increase eventually goes vertical, which is where we are now. And over the next 10 years, we're going to see the speed of computing, as we now know it today, increase 1 million times beyond where it is today. An increase of 1 million times in the speed of computing that we now experience. And we think computing is pretty darn fast today. Which means that over the next 10 years, more computing power is going to be created in the world than has ever existed in the world. Since 1959, when Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore invented the integrated circuit 1,000 yards from here on Charleston Road. More computing power is going to be created over the next 10 years than has ever existed. So that's a little bit of the technology history. And then the community history. The community existed, and community media was vitally needed in 1985 and 1992 when the cable industry was fighting these battles. And when the first public access channel went on the air in 1968, it created a whole new idea of community. It created the whole idea that community could be created with community-controlled media. That was the first time that idea had ever existed. And we've been working on that idea of community and media working together now for a very long time, since 1968, and here since 1990. So that's a little bit of the history, the three areas of the history: policy, technology, and community. Now let's talk a little bit about where those things stand today. If I were to look into the future and sort of think about the implications of policy for institutions like this, I don't think you'll ever see Congress revisit this idea ever again. Think about the problems Congress has revisiting even the most basic things today. If you remember a couple of years ago, Congress tried to introduce some legislation to regulate parts of the internet. Part of it was deciding to speed up the internet for some people and not have it be so fast for other people. Do you remember that? And then Google decided it was just going to take Google down for a day, so we wouldn't have Google for a day, just to show all of us and to show Congress what would happen if there were some unintended consequences for regulation, as there often are. Congress backed away from that very quickly. That was a hot potato. They really dropped it very quickly. I don't think you'll ever see a moment like we saw 25 or 30 years ago when Congress was willing to step back in and reconsider these communications issues. So now we're really faced with these questions being decided where I think all of us are a lot more comfortable with them being decided, which is here, locally, which is in the state of California, in Sacramento, which is in the city councils of Palo Alto, Menlo Park, places like that, where some funding decisions are going to be made and some policy decisions are being made, but you can invite your mayor in and see the mayor face to face. You can have community media covering city council meetings and making all of that transparent. I think that's where the political battles are going to be fought, to the extent that there are policy issues still bubbling around the future of community media. I think that's good news. I think it's good news for us as citizens, and I think it's good news for institutions like this, which are so important to our community. So I hope the transparency that has already begun with this kind of coverage that you've heard city councilmen and mayors come in today and embrace continues. It's good. It's good for all of us. It's not something that you can find simply on YouTube or on Twitter or any of those other places. It's really, its heart and soul lives in this studio and in the studios of thousands of other places like this around the country, the 3,000 or so institutions around the country that are doing public access media. So that's where I think the policy part of it stands. On the technology part of it, think about what's happening in technology today. When I think back 20 years ago when Newt Gingrich and the Republicans had launched their contract with America, and they, in the off-year elections during the first Clinton administration, had swept the Democrats from the House and the Senate, won majorities in both houses for the first time since Reconstruction. The first thing that Newt Gingrich did was go on C-SPAN and say, we're going to defund public broadcasting. That's our #1 agenda item for the new Republican Congress. I had just gone to work for PBS. I've been there about a year. I remember my good friend, the CEO, Irvin Duggan, called me up and he said, turn on your TV, turn on C-SPAN. Listen to what Newt Gingrich is saying. And sure enough, there he was. And he said, we're going to just defund public broadcasting. That'll be the end of it. Well, of course, that didn't happen. And one of the arguments that was put forth by the Republicans at that time is, who needs PBS? You know, we've got the Discovery Channel, we've got the Learning Channel, we've got the History Channel. All these things have done away with the need for publicly funded media in this country. Now, that was in the days before the internet. So think about if that same argument came up today and we were to try to decide, should community access media exist in this country? Because we've got Twitter, we've got YouTube, we've got Facebook, we've got all these places where you can produce your own media and you can circulate all of this. What would we think about that? Would that be the analog to Newt Gingrich saying we're going to defund public broadcasting? It might be. But if you think about it, think about Twitter. If you have 1,000 followers on Twitter, do you know where you are in the Twitterverse? You're in the top 4% of all Twitter users that subscribe to Twitter. If you have 1,000 followers, you're in the top 4%. That means 96% of everyone else on Twitter has fewer than 1,000 followers. You only need 1,000 followers to get into that percentile. So that means that technology, while very famous, is not very well penetrated. There are 30 hours of video uploaded onto YouTube every 60 seconds. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, where are you going to find what you need if you're going onto YouTube? Are you going to Google Indian carvings and find the incredible demonstration that we saw a few minutes ago and be able to find that? What if that's the one that you really, really want to see? That's not going to be possible either. So I think the argument today that community access media has been replaced or could be replaced by something else is as much of a fallacy as it was 25 years ago when Newt Gingrich was trying to defund public broadcasting. There's a plurality of opportunity and talent in this country, and community access media puts it all in one place for us in a way that still nothing else quite does. Now, I do think technology and Moore's Law is going to present some opportunities and some challenges. Beth, who was here earlier, has her Nikon camera on a stick. We just were featured in a 13-part series that China Central Television came. They sent a whole crew from Beijing to Silicon Valley. They spent 2 months here filming a 13-part series on the internet. All they brought were iPhones and digital SLRs, and they edited the entire series on a Macintosh. And that went out to 1 billion viewers in China about a year ago. So that's what technology is doing for us. It's going to make the tools much simpler and much more widely penetrated. You'll be able to produce a lot of amazing video using your iPhone and using your $900 Nikon camera, maybe 8, maybe 6, maybe 4 soon. And you'll be able to edit it all using a $2,000 Macintosh. And you'll be making films just as skillfully as anybody has ever made films. That's pretty amazing. But I actually think that's good news for public access media too, because it means more people who come and get trained here in these amazing facilities with these amazing cameras and this amazing editing suite and control room are going to go out and they're going to be really fabulous producers of media, which will then come back and benefit this this center and this community even more. So the technology part of it and that gift that Gordon Moore gave us all 50 years ago, I think is going to also be an important part of what's going to make these centers successful. The third thing, the community, that to me is the most important part, because we've seen it on display today. Look at the diversity of people who have been through this studio today. Think about the diversity of voices. Think about the diversity of viewpoints. Think about the different areas of the world that we see represented. This is Silicon Valley. And this studio sits uniquely, even physically, in a place that represents the ability to blend this incredibly diverse community. Just a mile from East Palo Alto, just 2 miles from Stanford. This is a crossroads. And this is where this diverse community can come together. And we can learn about each other, we can make media together, we can distribute that media now through these wonderful other means of distribution all over the world, and we can learn about each other in a way that may bring us all together. Again, make us even closer, help us understand each other more. And we need that understanding. So I think the technology part of this, which we celebrate in Silicon Valley, is a friend to these other two areas, the policy that made this center possible, and the community that makes it thrive and makes it successful. And if I were to look ahead at the future of community media, which I am doing today as your keynote speaker, I'd say I'd be incredibly optimistic, because I think this talent is going to harness the technology in this community to continue to be a really, really important part of Silicon Valley, of Palo Alto, of Menlo Park in this area, an important contributor to understanding in all of our lives. So, Annie, congratulations again to you and Elliot. It's an incredible accomplishment. You've given us all so much, and I'm really proud to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time for 2 quick questions. Does anyone have a question that they'd like John to tackle? Henrietta.
There is the assumption, when you mention Moore's Law, because it's acted the way it has in the past, why is there the assumption that it's going to act the same way in the future, and that computing will increase 1 million times more? And what will that mean? I mean, can you give us an example of what that might be? And why not assume someplace along the line that there might be a ceiling reached,
Wow,
like in human development?
What a great question. Is there a ceiling on Moore's Law, and what does this increase mean? So, real quickly, science can tell us now with incredible accuracy whether Moore's Law can continue and for how long. And the science of Moore's Law now shows that the spacing of a transistor on a piece of silicon, which is the key concept, is now less than 128 billionth of a human hair. And it's going to get even smaller over the next 10 years. And that is going to be the physical limit of Moore's Law, when transistors can't get any closer together. Because eventually, it's like you two sitting very close together. Eventually, electrons will start flying around between you in a way that we can't control, and that way chips stop working the way they're supposed to. But let me give you, I needed the answer to that question, so I asked one of our researchers. I said, give me an idea of what happens when Moore's Law increases computing power by another million times. So there now is a concept of something called a zettabyte. A zettabyte is 10 to the 21st power. If you needed to know what else in the world exists in the quantity of 10 to the 21st power, think of every grain of sand on every beach in the world. That's the number of silicon transistors that operate in the world today. Today. That's before this million-time increase that's going to happen over the next decade. A zettabyte, here's a way to measure a zettabyte. If you had a gigabyte on your music player, a gigabyte would hold 960 minutes of music. A zettabyte would hold 2 billion years worth of music. So we all want that zettabyte player, don't we? put it on shuffle. You never hear the same song twice. That's the kind of scale that we're talking about. 960 minutes of music for a gigabyte, 2 billion years worth of music for a zettabyte. And that's where this curve now is headed over the next 10 years. It's just going to be pretty astonishing.
Very good. One more question?
Yeah, just curious about your thoughts on the digital divide. We talk about community media center and being a place where people can come together and have affordable resources at the same time. When your iPhones are costing $500, $1,000, you know, there's challenges to getting access for everyone in terms of media. I'd love to just hear your thoughts about how we keep bridging that gap.
Yeah, you know, I think technology is the great unifier, and unfortunately now education is the great divider. And we have to fix the problem that education represents, I think, to help everyone have access to not only the tools that technology represent, but the learning in the humanities and the other things we need just to be educated citizens. I think sometimes our policy has us focusing too much on the digital divide in a way that makes us want to put more computers in schools. And I think what we need is a viewpoint that has us crossing the digital divide by increasing the quality of education for every child. And if we can do that, we'll help them find and use the tools that are available to them, whether it's technology or poetry. So I would really like to see us focus more on one than on the other.
Great. Thanks again,
All right,
John.
thank you.
Very good.